So this is part 2 of chapter 9, Man and His Doubles, from Foucault's The Order of Things. And part 2 is called The Place of the King, which is that place that is occupied by the spectator in the painting Las Meninas by Velázquez. Faced with so many instances of ignorance, so many questions remaining in suspense, no doubt some decision must be made. One must say, there is where discourse ends, and perhaps labor begins again. Yet there are still a few more words to be said, words whose status it is probably difficult to justify, since it is a matter of introducing at the last moment, rather like some deus ex machina, a character who has not yet appeared in the great classical interplay of representations. And let us, if we may, look for the previously existing law of that interplay in the painting of Las Meninas, in which representation is represented at every point. The painter, the palette, the broad, dark surface of the canvas with its back to us, the paintings hanging on the wall, the spectators watching, who are framed and turned by those who are watching them. And lastly, in the center, in the very heart of the representation, nearest to what is essential, the mirror, showing us what is represented, but as a reflection so distant, so deeply buried in an unreal space, so foreign to all the gazes being directed elsewhere, that it is no more than the frailest duplication of representation. All the interior lines of the painting, and above all those that come from the central reflection, point towards the very thing that is represented, but absent. At once object, since it is what the artist represented is copying onto his canvas, and subject, since what the painter had in front of his eyes as he represented himself in the course of all his work was himself, since the gazes portrayed in the picture are all directed towards the fictitious position occupied by the royal personage, which is also the painter's real place, since the occupier of that ambiguous place in which the painter and the sovereign alternate in a never-ending flicker, as it were, is the spectator, whose gaze transforms the painting into an object, the pure representation of that essential absence. Even so, that absence is not a lacuna, except for the discourse laboriously decomposing the painting, for it never ceases to be inhabited. And really, too, as is proved by the concentration of the painter thus represented, by the respect of the characters portrayed in the picture, by the presence of the great canvas with its back to us, and by our gaze, for which the painting exists and for which, in the depths of time, it was arranged. In classical thought, the personage for whom the representation exists and who represents himself within it, recognizing himself therein as an image or reflection, he who ties together all the interlacing threads of the representation in the form of a picture or table, he is never to be found in that table himself. Before the end of the 18th century, man did not exist any more than the potency of life, the fecundity of labor, or the historical density of language. He is a quite recent creature, which the demiurge of knowledge fabricated with its own hands less than 200 years ago. But he has grown old so quickly that it has been only too easy to imagine that he had been waiting for thousands of years in the darkness for that moment of illumination in which he would finally be known. Of course, it is possible to object that general grammar, natural history, and the analysis of wealth were all, in a sense, ways of recognizing the existence of man. But there is a distinction to be made. There is no doubt that the natural sciences dealt with man as with a species or a genus. The controversy about the problem of races in the 18th century testifies to that. Again, general grammar and economics made use of such notions as need and desire, or memory and imagination. but there was no epistemological consciousness of man as such. The classical episteme is articulated along lines that do not isolate in any way a specific domain proper to man. And if that is not sufficient, if it is still objected that even so, no period has accorded more attention to human nature, has given it a more stable, more definitive status, or one more directly presented to discourse, one can reply by saying that the very concept of human nature and the way in which it functioned excluded any possibility of a classical science of man. It is essential to observe that the functions of nature and human nature are in opposition to one another, term by term, in the classical episteme. Nature, through the action of a real and disordered juxtaposition, causes difference to appear in the ordered continuity of beings. Human nature causes the identical to appear in the disordered chain of representations, and does so by the action of a display of images. The one implies the fragmentation of a history in order to constitute actual landscapes. The other implies the comparison of non-actual elements which destroy the fabric of a chronological sequence. Despite this opposition, however, or rather through it, we see the positive relation of nature to human nature beginning to take shape. They act, in fact, upon identical elements, the same, the continuous, the imperceptible difference, the unbroken sequence. Both reveal against the background of an uninterrupted fabric the possibility of a general analysis which makes possible the distribution of isolable identities and visible differences over a tabulated space and in an ordered sequence. But they cannot succeed in doing this without each other, and it is there that the communication between them occurs. The chain of representations can, in effect, by means of the power it possesses to duplicate itself in imagination and memory, and in the multiple attention employed in comparison, rediscover, below the disorder of the earth, the unbroken expanse of beings. Memory, random at first, and at the mercy of representations as they capriciously present themselves to it, is gradually immobilized in the form of a general table of all that exists. Man is then able to include the world in the sovereignty of a discourse that has the power to represent its representation. In the act of speaking, or rather keeping as close as possible to what is essential in the classical experience of language, in the act of naming, human nature, like the folding of representation back upon itself, transforms the linear sequence of thoughts into a constant table of partially different beings. The discourse in which it duplicates its representations and expresses them is what links it to nature. Inversely, the chain of being is linked to human nature by the play of nature. For since the real world, as it presents itself to the gaze, is not merely the unwinding of the fundamental chain of being, but offers jumbled fragments of it, repeated and discontinuous, the series of representations in the mind is not obliged to follow the continuous path of imperceptible differences, extremes met within it. The same things occur more than once. Identical traits are superimposed in the memory. Differences stand out. Thus, the great, endless, continuous surface is printed with distinct characters in more or less general features, in marks of identification, and consequently in words. The chain of being becomes discourse, thereby linking itself to human nature and to the sequence of representations. This establishing of communication between nature and human nature on the basis of two opposite but complementary functions, since neither can take place without the other, carries with it broad theoretical consequences. For classical thought, man does not occupy a place in nature through the intermediary of the regional, limited, specific nature that is granted to him, as to all other beings, as a birthright. If human nature is interwoven with nature, It is by the mechanisms of knowledge and by their functioning, or rather in the general arrangement of the classical episteme, nature, human nature, and their relations are definite and predictable functional moments. And man, as a primary reality with his own destiny, as the difficult object and sovereign subject of all possible knowledge, has no place in it. The modern themes of an individual who lives, speaks, and works in accordance with the laws of an economics, a philology, and a biology, but who also, by a sort of intentional torsion and overlapping, has acquired the right, through the interplay of those very laws, to know them and to subject them to total clarification. All these themes, so familiar to us today and linked to the existence of the human sciences, are excluded by classical thought. It was not possible at that time that there should arise on the boundary of the world the strange stature of a being whose nature, that which determines it, contains it, and has traversed it from the beginning of time, is to know nature and itself in consequence as a natural being. In return, however, at the meeting point between representation and being, at the point where nature and human nature intersect, at the place in which we believe nowadays that we can recognize the primary, irrefutable, and enigmatic existence of man, what classical thought reveals is the power of discourse. In other words, language, insofar as it represents, language that names, patterns, combines, and connects and disconnects things as it makes them visible in the transparency of words. In this role, language transforms the sequence of perceptions into a table and cuts up the continuum of beings into a pattern of characters. Where there is discourse, representations are laid out and juxtaposed, and things are grouped together and articulated. The profound vocation of classical language has always been to create a table, a picture, whether it be in the form of natural discourse, the accumulation of truth, descriptions of things, a body of exact knowledge, or an encyclopedic dictionary. It exists, therefore, only in order to be transparent. It has lost that secret consistency, which, in the 16th century, inspiciated it, that's the congeal, it into a word to be deciphered, and interwove it with all the things of the world. It has not yet acquired the multiple existence about which we question ourselves today. In the classical age, discourse is that translucent necessity through which representation and beings must pass. As beings are represented to the mind's eye, and as representation renders beings visible in their truth, the possibility of knowing things and their order passes, in the classical experience, through the sovereignty of words. Words are, in fact, neither marks to be deciphered, as in the Renaissance period, nor more or less faithful and masterable instruments, as in the positivist period. They form rather a colorless network on the basis of which beings manifest themselves and representations are ordered. This would account for the fact that classical reflection upon language, even though comprised within a general arrangement of which it forms part by the same, right, as do the analysis of wealth and natural history, exercises, in relation to them, a regulating role. But the essential consequence is that classical language, as the common discourse of representation and things, as the place within which nature and human nature intersect, absolutely excludes anything that could be a science of man. As long as that language was spoken in Western culture, it was not possible for human existence to be called in question on its own account, since it contained the nexus of representation and being. The discourse that, in the 17th century, provided the link between the I think and the I am of the being undertaking it, that very discourse remained, in a visible form, the very essence of classical language. For what was being linked together in it was representation and being. The transition from the I think to the I am was accomplished in the light of evidence, within a discourse whose whole domain and functioning consisted in articulating one upon the other what one represents to oneself and what is. It cannot therefore be objected to this transition, either that being in general is not contained in thought, or that the singular being as designated by the I am has not been interrogated or analyzed on his own account. Or rather, these objections may well arise and command respect, but only on the basis of a discourse which is profoundly other, and which does not have for its raison d'etre the link between representation and being. Only a problematics able to bypass representation would formulate such objections. But as long as classical discourse lasted, no interrogation as to the mode of being implied by the cogito could be articulated.